Perfect. Then we can start. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for some of you. My name is Erik van Doorn. I'm a lecturer at the Walter Schücking Institute for International Law at Kiel University, as well as a postdoctoral researcher at the Geomar Helmholtz Center for Ocean Research, Kiel, in the same city in northern Germany. And together with my colleagues, Paula Fernandez Veloso and Dina Eparkina, I am actually co-convening this session. And this session is on ocean best practices and ocean policy. And I will try to give you a little bit of an introduction into what the plan is that we're here to do, what our thoughts were about how to actually go about this session. We decided to divide it in two parts. Part one is today, and part two will be on Monday in the European afternoon, so at 2 o'clock Central European Summer Time. And you can access that via this very same link. What we want to do today is to focus on the law and on the policy. And we had invited 4 speakers today. 2 lawyers and 2 policy people, and 1 lawyer unfortunately came down with a fever last night, so Rosemarijn Roland Holst can unfortunately not be here. And the other person, a couple of hours before, Nicolas Zegenbarth from the European Commission, could also not make it because he was called in last minute to a meeting to meet with some American people. So we are very happy that Toste Tanjoa, who's actually also my boss at Geomar, wants to jump in and wants to give a little bit of wants to give a presentation about what we have done in a Horizon Europe project called EuroSea, where we look at how to improve ocean observations, especially in Europe, and what we've been doing there so far from a legal perspective. And Toste will give a little bit of an introduction about that. On Monday, I'll give you a short introduction to Monday as well. On Monday, we look at it from the science side. So where we look at today, okay, how does law and policy actually react to what science comes up, right? When we talk about ocean observing. On Monday, we look at it from the science side. How does the science actually tries to bring their science to the policy realm? And for that, we have a couple of examples. The first example is given by the co-chair of the working group 2 of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Hans Otto Pertner. And then we have examples on aquaculture from Inger Graves from Norway. We have an example from Brazil, working on marine plastics and certification of ocean best practices from Alexander Tura from the University of Rio de Janeiro. And we have Enrique Alvarez from Spain, who will talk about the EuroSea specific ideas that have been coming up. So that's for Monday, but we'll start today. I will introduce the speakers, and then we will, so we have 3 speakers today. I will introduce those speakers to you, and then we have some time for discussion. And since we have 1 speaker less, so to say, than planned, let's see how the discussion goes. We have the full time until noon Central European summertime, so 2 hours from now. If we have to stop earlier, that is also okay. We will see how it goes. Everybody on board? No questions so far? Good. Then I will just go straight ahead to introduce our first speaker from today, Yoshinobu Takai. Yoshi is at the Keio University in Tokyo, and Yoshi got his PhD at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, then moved to Kiel University, was actually my office mate for a little bit, and then moved, I think it was 2014, Yoshi, if I'm correct, moved to the World Maritime University in Malmö in Sweden. From there on, then moved to the United Nations Secretariat, more specifically the Division of Ocean Affairs and Law of the Sea, which he will probably touch upon in his presentation in a little bit. And now I think, was it last year, Yoshi, that you moved to Keio University, right? Yeah. Okay, great. Then, Yoshi, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Let me share my screen, my presentation. And I hope everybody can see my presentation, and also you can hear me clearly, I hope. All right.
Yoshi, we cannot see your presentation yet. That's probably because I need to make you a co-host. Let me do that quickly.
Okay.
You are now a co-host, and I think now you should be able to share your screen.
Perfect.
Yeah, great.
All right, great. Thank you very
Thanks
much.
very much.
Good, and well, good evening from my side, and good morning and good afternoon to you all. And
Yoshi, sorry to interrupt. We can actually see now your notes as well.
Okay, so maybe the slides are a bit smaller there. Maybe
no, you should switch it to the other screen or something.
Oh yeah. Okay, let me do that.
Yeah, I know. There's an option where you can say which screen you present to.
Right. Yeah.
We can't read it very well with it.
Okay.
Under Paul. You've got two screens, have you?
Yeah, that's right. And can you see both screens, or can you see?
No,
only...
we can see one. Normally you can choose which one you present to. It's one of the options on presentations, no?
Yeah.
Let's see. It's if I go to slideshow, it's got on the right, it's got monitor automatic, and you can show presentation on, and then you can choose which monitor you show the presentation on.
Right. Okay.
Otherwise, we can just see your notes as well. It's not.
That's even more convenient. I was kind of hoping to show, because some of the fonts are small, so perhaps it's a bit easier for you to see the full page presentation instead of the one with the script. I don't want to spend too much time on that.
No, otherwise we can see it as well now, Yoshi. So that we see, so to say, your whole screen. So we see what you look when you're building a presentation, so to say. But so it's not in presenter mode, but we can see your slides very well.
Okay. Oh, if that's the case, I think that's not too bad.
No.
Sure. Let me. Okay, before just trying to quickly go back to the presentation.
If you could also try actually to leave the sharing, Yoshi, and then when starting to share, you pick screen 1. So
right.
You share one screen.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's an idea.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Yoshi.
Okay. Okay. Now, I don't know. Anyway, so perhaps I think this is how it should be. So I don't know which screen you are looking at, but
we are now looking at your notes again. So if you could go back to the first screen you just had a second ago, that was how it's.
Yeah, but that one was actually without my notes, but it was still the the presentation, PowerPoint presentation was showing only only one of the screens, and the one which didn't have the notes. But anyway, I can work with either of these.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is great.
That's good.
Okay.
This is perfect.
All right, finally. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Perfect. Great. I even don't remember where I ended, but well, first of all, I just wanted to say that it's my honor to be here, and I'm delighted to participate in this workshop. And thank you, Eric, for inviting me. Thank you and other co-organizers. So my task today is to introduce the international legal framework for ocean observing and the role of international organizations in 15 minutes, which is a little bit challenging, but I guess with one presenter less, perhaps I might be able to steal some time from the program, I guess. So first, I will briefly describe the international legal frameworks relating to ocean observing. In particular, I will first focus my discussions on what legal provisions are applicable to various types of in situ observations. These discussions will be followed by the description of the role of international organizations in relation to ocean observing. The presentation concludes with some suggestions for the way forward. All right, so let's first look at this figure, which was taken from a document prepared under Goose. It shows a number of platforms that are currently used for ocean observing. They include both in situ and remote collection of data. And I'd say there is another way of measuring some parameters, for example, through submarine cables. So this is not perhaps the full picture of the entire range of platforms, but I think these are the main platforms for ocean observing currently. Okay, so the latter type of platforms, namely data collection from satellites and aircraft, are governed by air law and space law, respectively, while the former type of platforms, in situ collection of ocean data, is subject to the international law of the sea, as reflected in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, which is often dubbed as a constitution for the oceans. Perhaps some of you might be familiar with that word. To be precise, however, in some cases, the international law of the sea also touches upon satellites and aircraft. For example, UNCLOS deals with overflight in the airspace of various kinds of maritime zones, setting out the rights of coastal states and freedoms of all states. And it also refers to the launching of aircraft in illustrating activities that are considered as not innocent passage. And therefore, these activities may not be undertaken without the consent of the coastal state. Furthermore, although UNCLOS does not refer to the launching of space objects from the sea in its text, unlike that of aircraft, and therefore it is not entirely clear where and under which circumstances coastal states may regulate such launching by foreign entities. This is an issue that attracts increasing attention, given the high-profile projects for sea-based launches from offshore platforms, such as those by SpaceX. Having said that, the main legal framework governing remote sensing from satellites is found in the Outer Space Treaty and other space-related normative instruments, including 1986 remote sensing principles adopted within the framework of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COPIOS. Although the Outer Space Treaty does not contain any provision explicitly referring to remote sensing, it has been understood that the freedom for exploration and the use of the outer space, and Article 1 of that treaty supports remote sensing. Whether the consent of the states that are sensed is required has been heavily discussed in the lead up to the remote sensing principles, but the adapted principles do not require consent or notification. Let us now turn to in situ observations of the ocean and consider what legal provisions are applicable to ocean observing. This is not a straightforward question, given the multitude of platforms currently used for ocean observing, as we have just seen minutes ago. UNCLOS contains provisions for a number of categories of activities that address some form of data collection at sea, including hydrographic surveys, prospecting for and exploration of marine resources, search for archaeological and historical objects, and last but not least, marine scientific research, MSR. UNCLOS sets out rights and obligations of states in connection with each of these activities in different maritime zones. We could divide these maritime zones into 3 categories. The first category relates to marine areas under sovereignty, namely internal waters and the territorial sea, as well as archipelagic waters. On the screen, you see these internal waters and the territorial sea, which is 12 nautical miles from the baseline on the left side. And the second category of maritime zones relates to marine areas beyond those areas under sovereignty, but still under national jurisdiction. And these are the areas called exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf. These are the areas you see on the screen. At the center of the screen, the exclusive economic zone covers both water column and the seabed, while the continental shelf is only for the seabed area. Finally, outside the outer limits of the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf are marine areas beyond national jurisdiction, namely the high seas and the area or the deep seabed. Generally speaking, the closer to the shore, the more control coastal states have over these activities. For MSR, coastal states have the exclusive authority to regulate these activities in the territorial sea, while in the EEZ and on the continental shelf, coastal states merely have jurisdiction, which is short of sovereignty. What this means is actually elaborated in part 13 of UNCLOS, according to which MSR in the EEZ or on the continental shelf requires advanced coastal state consent, or sometimes called clearance. Although the research platforms might be rather limited compared to the present-day practice, when UNCLOS was negotiated in the 1970s and 1980s, deployment and use of any new type of scientific research installations or equipment would fall under this consent requirement. In some instances, clearance procedures that are less cumbersome are already envisaged in UNCLOS, including those for research objects, for research projects by an international organization. And there is another regime called implicit consent regime, which is also a way to go without explicit coastal state requirement. It is widely recognized that for MSR in areas under national jurisdiction, the consent requirement is at the heart of the legal regime under UNCLOS. At the same time, however, it is important to recall that under UNCLOS, states and competent international organizations shall promote and facilitate the development and conduct of marine scientific research, and coastal states shall, in normal circumstances, grant their consent for MSR projects by other states or competent international organizations. However, there are exceptions. Coastal states may, in their discretion, withhold their consent to the conduct of a MSR project if that project is, for example, of direct significance for the exploration and exploitation of natural resources, whether living or non-living. In the water column of the high seas or in the deep seabed, all states have the right to conduct MSR. Oftentimes, the scientific community complains about the delay in the processing and granting of MSR clearance and divergent regulatory practice of various states. At the same time, instances of MSR without consent or in violation of the conditions given have been observed so far. Based on these examples, I would say that implementation is lacking on both sides, on the side of coastal states and also on the side of implementers of MSR projects. For hydrographic surveys like MSR, coastal states' regulatory authority extends to those conducted in areas under sovereignty. However, there is no explicit provision on hydrographic surveys in other areas, including the EEZ and the continental shelf. Therefore, some argue that hydrographic surveys may be allowed as part of the freedom of navigation and associated freedoms in the EEZ, whereas others take the view that hydrographic surveys do not fall under these freedoms. For the high seas, hydrographic surveys are widely considered to be part of high seas freedoms. For submarine cables, again, coastal states have the authority to regulate the laying of submarine cables in areas under sovereignty. Beyond the territorial sea, the freedom to lay submarine cables in the EEZ, the right of all states to lay submarine cables on the continental shelf, as well as the high seas freedoms. All of these entitlements provide a legal basis for the deployment of submarine cables by all states. Although coastal states have certain regulatory power over submarine cables in their continental shelf. Excuse me, and despite the fact that most of the provisions of UNCLOS, including those on MSR, are accepted as reflecting customary international law, there are some uncertainties in the context of ocean observing. First of all, a crucial issue here is that UNCLOS does not directly define the term marine scientific research, and the scope of the provisions related to MSR is not without controversy. In particular, whether the so-called operational oceanography is exempted from the requirement of coastal state consent has been widely debated. On the one hand, the drafting history of UNCLOS may indicate that operational oceanography was intended to be outside the scope of MSR provisions of UNCLOS. This is the view taken, for example, by the United States and seemingly shared by the World Meteorological Congress a few years ago. On the other hand, a number of states treat operational oceanography as MSR and require their permission if it is conducted within areas under their national jurisdiction. For example, the European Union takes the view that ocean observations are governed by MSR provisions of UNCLOS. This tension was highlighted when the advisory body of experts on the law of the sea within the framework of IOC UNESCO considered development of the guidelines for algal floats, which issue we could come back shortly. In the next slide, I think. Second, the legal regime governing submarine cables that have the capacity to measure certain parameters, such as smart cables, is also subject to discussion, in particular, whether the consent requirement for MSR is applicable to such cables. Like ocean observing, submarine cables are indispensable for our lives these days, whereas security concerns that may arise from the deployment of such cables are understandable. it is to be seen how these conflicting interests could be reconciled in the future. Last but not least, I should also note that regardless of the applicability of MSR provisions under UNCLOS, activities taking place at sea are governed by UNCLOS, including provisions on the protection and preservation of the marine environment as complemented by various other instruments such as IMO conventions. Now moving on to the issue of the role of international organizations. We can identify a number of UN system organizations that are relevant to ocean data, most notably IOC, UNESCO, and WMO. The United Nations General Assembly, which has the competence to review all developments in ocean affairs, including those issues relating to ocean science, is also relevant here, together with processes established by the GA, including the regular process for global reporting and assessment of the state of the marine environment, and the United Nations open-ended informal consultative process on oceans and the law of the sea. Since the interpretation of UNCLOS may be at issue, I would say meeting of states parties may also play a role here, possibly. In addition, many UN system organizations and bodies are relevant, which are complemented by many others, including global ones such as the International Hydrographic Organization and regional environmental and sectoral bodies. While international organizations are working on the basis of their own mandates and priorities, and consequently their activities are diverse, the role they may play cannot be underestimated. Some of these organizations provide a forum for developing normative instruments such as treaties and non-legally binding instruments, including resolutions. A prime example in this regard is the development of the guidelines regarding the deployment of profiling frauds in the high seas within the framework of the ARGO program at the IOC UNESCO. With the creation of the ARGO notification scheme, these guidelines succeeded in establishing an enabling framework for the deployment of ARGO floats that may drift into the EEZ from the high seas or from another state's EEZ, not requiring any coastal state consent in advance. In addition, some also are engaged in the coordination of activities among states and other stakeholders, also capacity building and technical assistance. In some cases, states seek to resolve disputes with other states through dispute settlement mechanisms within the framework of international organizations, including through adjudication by international courts and tribunals. In the context of MSR, one important role international organizations could play relates to Article 247 of UNCLOS. Under this article, there is a pathway for simplified procedures for research projects organized by an international organization. In this regard, IOC, UNESCO, and PICES have already adopted such procedures, although I'm not aware of the actual use of these procedures to date. So this is my last slide. Before concluding, it is worth mentioning some of the possible ways for ensuring sustained ocean observations from an international legal and policy perspective. First, with regard to interpretation of UNCLOS, which, as we have seen, sometimes became an issue, we could consider looking for a possible pathway to initiate a discussion on this issue. Since state parties to UNCLOS are in a position to interpret the convention, the meeting of state parties comes to mind first as a possible forum. However, the mandate of the meeting has been debated heavily, and some take the view that the meeting is also only for administrative and budgetary issues. This is not very realistic. Therefore, we should consider perhaps other bodies, for example, the UNGA, or processes established thereby in this regard. And indeed, this year's ICP informal consultative process meeting was focused on ocean observing. And indeed, Toste was one of the presenters, so perhaps he could share his insights from the meeting, I think. When disputes arise, States could also consider using dispute settlement procedures under UNCLOS, or in some cases seeking an advisory opinion, for example, from the International Court of Justice, or when conditions are met from the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. Second, we could also consider more pragmatic solutions to the problems concerned, including how to ensure the smooth operation of platforms other than algo floats and the timely processing of MSR applications. A process could be initiated, for example, under the UNGA or under IOC UNESCO. And there, I understand there was some development within the context of the IOC earlier this year. Perhaps, but given the limited time, I cannot fully speak about that, but perhaps when there is a discussion time left, we could discuss that. The last option could be to find region-specific solutions, including by taking advantage of underutilized Article 247 procedures. But given the fact that these procedures haven't been used for several decades, perhaps it's easier for us to identify what would be the problems in using these procedures and possibly address these issues. So this is the end of my presentation, and of course, I'm happy to elaborate any of the issues I just spoke in the discussion time. Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you very much, Yoshinobu. That was a great overview. Thanks so much. It also actually points nicely to the next two speakers that we have. So we will for sure pick up some of these points in the discussion, as you already mentioned. There was one question in the chat, which is more or less an understanding question. So maybe you would be able to answer that now, Yoshi. Tosta asked, so what is actually the difference between hydrographic surveys and marine scientific research? How do you make that distinction?
Right. Well, actually, yeah, it's a question about the understanding, and I think it's, well, hydrographic surveys are considered, at least in my understanding, they are considered to be related to the measurement of, for example, the depth and the bathymetry of the seabed, and it is for the purpose of ensuring safe navigation of ships. And I'm not an expert, clearly, but there might be some activities under the term ocean observing, which could fall within the definition or description of the hydrographic surveys I just mentioned. And MSR perhaps is a rather wide-reaching concept. And I think any scientific research directed at increasing the understanding, humankind's understanding of the ocean and how the ocean relates to the, how the ocean creates interrelations with other parts of the ecosystem. That's, at least in my understanding, that's MSR. And I'm not sure, but at least in the legal text of the convention UNCLOS, these are two distinct concepts and supposed to be addressing different activities. But I'm happy to hear experts' views on if there's any overlap between these two concepts.
Yeah, great. Yeah, Tosta reacted just now in the chat already to it. So maybe this is also a point that we could, and because I think this distinction is really important when we talk about clearance, right? So this is maybe a point that we can pick up later after the other talks in the discussion. And Angel, I think your point is also highly interesting and might actually evoke a lot of discussion. So if you don't mind, I would like to pick that up in the discussion after the other talks as well. With that, I would also welcome everybody that if you have questions and if they come up, please put them in the chat, right? And we will either address them quickly if it's a factual question, or address them afterwards. Yoshi, thanks again a lot. We will pick up on a lot of points you made, like said already, in the discussion later on. I would now go to Ian Shepard's presentation, and that is maybe picking up also on the more regional part, because Ian has been working for a long time at the European Commission, more specifically at the Directorate General for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries. Now recently retired, but still working a lot on these kind of issues, as I heard. Since working in Brussels, your background is also very fitting, I think, Ian.
Okay.
The Tintin background. I appreciate that. Without any further ado, I would now like to give you the floor to give us an insight in how ocean science can actually, and ocean observations can actually be taken up into policy, especially from an EU perspective. Thanks so much, Ian, for sharing your contribution with us.
Okay, thanks. That was a very good presentation previously, and I've got a couple of questions, but we'll do that afterwards. But now I'll move into mine, see if it works. Share. Okay, can you see it? Yes. Okay.
Works.
Okay, so I'm going to just give a few examples of the interaction of science policy and ocean observation, and maybe without a definite conclusion, but things that might give you something to think about, how it works in practice. So, you know, first of all, we're faced with the classic question, you know, what is truth? This is the famous painting showing Pontius Pilate at the judgment of Jesus. I am the truth, said Jesus. And Pilate says, but what is truth? This is the question we always need to ask. So I would ask to say something about what's good practice. And fisheries science in the EU is, you know, in some respects is quite well, quite good practice. There's a very well funded data collection, about 70 million a year, which is targeted towards solving the policy issues. And in fact, the EU spends more on data collection than research on fisheries. It's something like 70 million a year on data collection and about 20 million on research, which is exactly the opposite for other types of marine measurements. And we spend far more on research, something like, I don't know, it's upwards of 100, 200 million a year on research, but practically nothing on data collection. So it's good, and the process is good for advising on what can be caught. What's less good about it? Fisheries managers don't like wide uncertainty bands. You know, they want to be told that if you catch 30,000 tons, it's okay. If it's 31,000, it's not good. If it's 29,000, it's not good, because they want to have an argument when they present it to the fishermen, so that the fishermen can't say, oh, it's uncertain. But unfortunately, uncertainty exists. And scientists are often asked impossible questions like, what's the impact of climate on fisheries in 2050? You know, this is an impossible question that is sometimes asked. And then, who do we believe? At the moment, there's a big debate on the impact of bottom trawling on carbon. There's a paper in Nature that that suggests that trawling can disturb the bottom sediments, which releases the carbon into the ocean and increases acidification. If you do the numbers that it comes up with in this paper, then it comes up to about 1% of what of EU's normal contribution of EU's emissions. So it's significant. Then you read another paper which was written afterwards, although it was partly funded by the fishing industry, that says this is an order of magnitude too high, and this is so at least one order of magnitude too high. And this is very important for policy, because of course we've got the Greens on one side using it as an argument, which they want to do anyway, to limit bottom trawling, and you've got the other side, you've got the fishermen who believe the bottom one. So we're in difficult situations sometimes. Then another example: how much plastic is there coming from rivers into the ocean? And up to now, everybody's quoted Jambeck et al. 2015 paper in Science, which is, of course, as you know, a reputable paper, and they say it's between 5 and 12 million tons of plastic a year coming in. But then there's a paper in 2021 pointing out errors in this analysis, saying that they didn't convert the number of particles of plastic to mass correctly. Just have to switch this off. That there's an inappropriate mixing of data collected with different sampling techniques, and the relationship between river density and mismanaged plastic waste was wrong, because they come up with they work out how much waste is mismanaged and say relate that to and they say it's a few thousand metric tons per year, so it's about 3 orders of magnitude less than that. So again, who do we believe? What is the truth? And so how do we use this sort of information in policy? I was involved in the impact assessments for a revision of the Port Reception Facilities Directive and the Single-Use Plastics Directive, both of which put in severe measures against marine litter. The port reception facilities, for instance, the review or the revision, the new made it forbids ports from charging from litter brought ashore for the processing. So there's no penalty for somebody bringing litter to bring it to the shore, and so there's no incentive to dump it at sea. So, and the Single-Use Plastics Directive, of course, has banned a lot. One of the principal reasons for it was to stop pollution at sea, and it banned or put targets for reduction of a lot of single-use plastics, and it also imposed measures on fishing gear for the safe disposal at the end of life. So these were quite important, and we had to, before we could propose these laws, which now did become laws, we had to show that the impact of the law would have the desired effect. But the only usable data that we found really from ocean observation was a list of the 10 most common articles found on the beach. Not the quantity, but or the distribution, but which they're just an identification of what they were. Enormous public pressure helped. You know, probably David Attenborough's program Planet Ocean really helped. Apparently, that was more watched on in the United Kingdom than Strictly Come Dancing, which is, you know, a big thing. So but another thing to realize is how quickly we need to do these analyses. Often we get something like 3 months to come up with a scientific case, and the commission procurement practices mean we can't hire useful scientific support because we often rely on consultants who didn't produce. In this case, they didn't produce much useful. You know, I'm not going to name them. Well, you know them, the big four: Deloitte, Ecoris, etc., etc. So we couldn't get useful scientific support for it. So that's quick decisions needed and lack of useful scientific advice. So next slide. Now we're looking at blue carbon. I think, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about blue carbon. We're thinking of measures, but this is an area where it really needs targeted scientific advice, science. But there's a lot out there that we need more measurements, more consistency between the measurements. And what is not really understood is that for reporting for emissions and sequestration, there has to be some action for it. It's not just enough to protect the ecosystem. It has to change in some way. The human activity has to have some effect. I mean, we often hear, you know, how much carbon the ocean absorbs, you know, 1/3 or whatever it is, but it's not really relevant to the discussion. It's how the human activity affects the absorption that we need to know. And this can either be by destroying the ecosystem, by creating it, or managing it in some way. And this is an important issue that we're working on now. Another issue that we had was how can we get more food from the oceans? And this work, we asked the Commission's scientific advisor, and this time it wasn't so urgent. We had a couple of years to do it, and they came up with an answer that was obvious, really. But it's a useful support if it comes from an authoritative source for us to quote. They said the only way that you're going to increase the food is through low trophic species, particularly through aquaculture. So that means low trophic level, non-fed aquaculture such as algae or shellfish. So this did work because it was a simple question, and it gave an answer. Often, I know we make the error of not making the question clear enough when we're asking researchers for something. Now we come to Fukushima. And we were asked a question: is it safe for the EU to import fish from the Pacific? And we had to make this decision quickly because public safety mattered, public confidence in imported food mattered. So to do it, we had to collect a lot of information, collected a lot of scientists, because the problem was that within 200 miles of Japan, within the EEZ, the fish were only caught by Japanese fishermen, and we knew something about the controls there. But outside the 200-mile zone, it could be caught by anybody, and particularly tuna, and then enter the market. Was it safe to import these fish? And it was quite a complicated question. You thought maybe a tuna goes into the zone, eats some smaller fish, and comes out again. In the end, sorry, I'm recovering from COVID, but what was important, and was that the radioactivity doesn't accumulate in the fish, but it establishes there's a diffusion between the amount in the fish and the water, and this is what saved us. It's a half-life, not of the radioactivity, but of the concentration relative to the water. But anyway, this was this statement that you see here was an editorial in Nature, and I totally agree with it, because at the time we were having to rely. I mean, the Japanese government was very good at providing information, but in PDF files, you know, measurement station of the concentrations of water in various places, longitude, latitude, their concentration in different species of fish. And we needed this information, but it took us, it wasn't very easy to access, to convert it into numerical information. And as they say here, exactly, working on the problem, we had a big wide variety of people, because we were calling research labs, we were calling people who we knew had expertise in the migration routes of tuna, in toxicity of and in half-lives, etc. But people, and in these sorts of emergencies, these communities can get together to try to solve the problem. If the data are made available in an informative and compelling way. I mean, it's the same with COVID now. So that was a lesson that we had from this. So then this is an example that isn't from the sea, but there was is it safe to eat beef during the crisis of mad cows? And in 1990, the agricultural minister was trying to show that it was safe, and he was widely publicized giving his daughter a beef burger, and fortunately his daughter grew up quite well. But in 2008, which is 18 years later, they discovered that maybe you can catch humans can catch this disease from contaminated meat. It was thought to be impossible. And there was a public inquiry after this, the Phillips inquiry, and Robert May, the chief UK scientist at the time, is one of my heroes. But what he said, I think, is true in in a lot of cases. I often see it that, and even within my own organization, that there's a temptation to keep all the data secret and the facts close, and then you have an internal discussion to work out what the conclusion is, and so that you can have a simple message in the for the market. I mean, it's probably even true in fisheries. We try to say, yes, this catch limit, you will be safe. We're not going to do overfishing. But Robert May says, no, we have to resist this temptation, and that the full messy process where scientific understanding is arrived at has to be spilled out into the open. So I think this is true for everything. So I think that's about it. So some messages: be open. When we often need answers very, very quickly, sometimes one day in the political process, rarely longer than 6 months. So, you can't launch a new set of instructions once you go. So that is, those are just some case studies showing the difficulties that we have in using science in policy, and the successes as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Those were great insights. Thanks so much for sharing those. I got a couple of questions too, but I will just save them for the part on the discussion. So, as you have realized by now, but for those people that joined a little bit later, we had 2 cancellations in the last couple of hours when it came to our speakers. So Rosemarijn Roland Holst unfortunately got a fever, so she cannot attend today. We're happy that Ian is there, although recovering from COVID. And Nicola Zegenbart could not be there because he had another important appointment last minute today, which he was called into. Luckily enough, Toste Tanua, senior scientist at GMR, wanted to share some of his slides with us, which Yoshi already alluded to, actually. And Yoshi mentioned that Toste was at the state parties meeting for the Law of the Sea Convention in June last year, and some of these things were discussed there. Toste, thank you so much for wanting to do this at the last minute. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Eric. I hope you see the right screen and all that. So this meeting in June was this year, Eric, not last year, but so luckily I had this presentation sitting here and I made it for June, and I didn't have time to prepare, but it's not that long ago, and it as Eric pointed out, it really ties very nicely into the presentation Yoshi has gave, and I'm gonna give you a little bit of an overview of the EuroSea project that is funding Eric and is part of Eric at least, and the work we do here on the legal aspects of the sea. And basically EuroSea is trying to make or design an European ocean observing and forecasting system that is sustainable. And the vision is the research and innovation towards a user-focused, truly interdisciplinary and responsive European ocean observing and forecasting system, and that delivers then to the essential information needed for human well-being and safety, sustainable development and blue economy in the changing world. And I think Ian really nicely alluded to the need for information, sometimes on a very short time scale. And EuroSea is trying to build an information system along the value chain of ocean information to be able to deliver that information, not just in terms of scientific papers that sometimes are contradictory and hard to see through for a non-expert and maybe even for experts. So we are really looking at improving the European ocean observing system to the global context and deliver ocean observation and forecast to increase the knowledge about climate and ecosystems and how human impacts are impacting the systems of marine life. We also want to demonstrate the importance of the ocean because it's an important economic part of society, and a healthy ocean is important for a healthy society in general. So I will talk about two major topics that is on the table by EuroSea, and the one is about ocean integration, and the second one is about legal aspects, and the second one then ties into Yoshi's presentation. But let me start here with the vision for ocean integration. And it really comes down to, and you can see this figure to the right here, which is a global ocean observing system figure here, who's showing some of the complexity. So we have many different disciplines. We have, satellites, remote sensings, and we have also observations done in situ in the ocean. We need to look at multiple different numerical models to understand the observations. We're looking at many different spatial temporal scales. We're looking at things that happens over a very short time period, like tsunamis and storm surges, and long time periods like sea level rise and ocean acidification and other issues. So there's a very wide spectrum that we need to cover. So when it comes to the integration of the ocean observing system, we try to optimally combine all elements to form a coherent whole. So one other way of looking at this is to measure once, use many times, but also that the measurement, the observation you may do for one purpose might be useful for another purpose. And it comes into a design to respond to many different requests on ocean information that the ocean observing and forecasting system then needs to respond to. So the system itself, the observing system, are only partially adequate today. We have lots of gaps in the coverage, both in space and time, but also in terms of essential ocean variables. And many of the processes that we want to understand are, simply inefficiently observed. And then we have the issue of observations that are still locked up somewhere and cannot be used to the full extent. And we're talking about the FAIR principles of the technical standards of how you deliver data, so they are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And many observations are not fit for multi-purpose use. So you can think that you design your observation scheme or observing scheme for one particular purpose that you were interested in or got funding for, but that means that maybe these observations are not quite fit enough to answer another question with a very small extra investment would have made possible. So that's a design issue. Still not so good coordination between actors. So it means that there are some duplications and not optimal use of resources then for that. And also it leads to gaps. So I think we in Europe and worldwide could be a little bit better and coordinating our efforts. So we can do this integration through a number of different steps here. So we can build mission-based organizations that agree on common agenda and principles. We can establish clear design and implementation plans, which I think is really critical. We need coordination and we need design and the plan. We also need to think about how we can govern that ocean observing system. Now it's very fragmented with poor coordination and not a really overarching strategy. And that means a governance structure that can respond to that. We also need to reach some kind of sustainability in what we do. So funding is one part, but we also need to be more efficient in communicating the value of ocean observing. This is not something only for science geeks. It's actually information that is very useful and important for society. And this, decide weather forecasts, climate forecasts, and things like this. So we need to facilitate that transition from the research to operations, and Ian really pointed that out. In fisheries, the ratio is 70-20 between research and operations, whereas in the marine science is the other way around. And we need to have a little bit more transition to be more sustainable in what we're doing. And it's also a culture shift. We need to talk to different communities, talking about that width for ocean observing we talked about. We need to foster that, the fair data principles, but also making the data open and freely available, which is not covered by the FAIR principles. And in terms of carriers, we need to redefine how we define ocean or scientific excellence when it comes to ocean science. It's an ocean observing system that delivers societal benefit information cannot just thrive on scientists that get promoted by writing excellent science papers. We need to have other bonus here, another way of looking at these things. So that will be, better alignment with societal needs here. We can improve our modeling and predictions. We can be more interdisciplinary. We can advance faster the knowledge. We can, be more complete and useful, and we can understand the different scales a little better if we use the same resources that we have in a more efficient way. We have, mutual beneficial relationships. So by integrating different actors here, and in the end, we have a much better or higher benefit cost ratio of ocean observations. And in the end, we have a better well-being for society and a more collaborative culture. So this is a little bit of my pitch here for having an integrated ocean observing system. My second pitch here really comes in then to what Yoshi was talking about here. So I gave this presentation at the United Nations in New York in June to members of DUALOS and representatives of nations. And to them, this was a very, very provocative statement. And the UNCLOS, the United Nations Conventions of the Law of the Seas, Marine Scientific Research, UNCLOS MSR process is incompatible with the operational reality of sustained ocean observing. And the reason is, I think Yoshi also mentioned that the UNCLOS was conceived in the 1970s, 1980s, where research was done from research vessel by state actors for scientific purpose. Now we have many different platforms and ways to observe the ocean. And we have a different requirement of information to society and policymakers, like Ian was looking for, that is different than how UNCLOS was convinced at one time. So for instance, there is no constancy between the practice among coastal states for getting MSR clearance. There are some suggestions from DUALOS how to do that, but nations are very often using slightly different forms and processes, which make it pretty complicated. And the procedures are not sufficiently flexible to adapt to changes in operations. And we know that things are changing due to weather and technical issues and so on. This is a very complicated, often and time-consuming process. Takes a lot of resources from scientists that want to do ocean observations. And sometimes the demands are so costly or simply impossible to apply to or comply to. So many, I can tell you many issues where we simply didn't do the observations because it was too complicated. And it's very often it's common to get the MSR clearance at such a light state that your whole planning for operations is in jeopardy. So these are some of the issues that we face in reality, working with the article or section 13 of the UNCLOS. we as scientists and ocean observers really want to obey the law or follow the law and don't want to do any illegal stuff, but it becomes almost impossible at sometimes. So for many of the modern instruments, it's almost impossible to have that advance notice of 6 months for sustained ocean observings for some platforms. And to the right here, you see a very special platform, a little sea turtle with some kind of sensor and a transmission unit glued to its back. We cannot plan the operations far ahead for many reasons, and then you have a requirement to actually plan far ahead because of UNCLOS compatibility. And this issue here with ships of opportunity programs is probably maybe one of the more difficult ones. These are typical non-state actors. We have instruments on private ships that change the courses. They no way they're going to know 6 months in advance where they're going, and sometimes it's impossible even for these actors to find a door to make this MSR process. So that is a big issue, and I think the ships of opportunity is one of these projects where we really can get a lot of data from the ocean that we need. It's similar to the VOS program, the voluntary observing ships, where they take meteorological measurements, and that is somehow completely legal, and all ships can do that. And Eric and Yoshi can tell you about how that came about, but basically, as long as you take an observation of something in the water, it is scientific marine research and you need a permission. And these vessels are, they change routes on short notice and so on. And the animal-borne sensors, ANIBOS, the seals and the turtle to the right here is, we don't control them very well how they are swimming, right? So solutions here, and Eric and we attended this workshop in UNESCO in February 2020, just before COVID struck. The report is out since a couple of months here. So one of the solution spaces that we talk about here is to regulate ocean data, not the collection itself. That would be one possible solution that we could talk about. And when I'm saying these things here is I want to make attention to the policy that there's an issue, that we waste a lot of resources and we're missing a lot of ocean information and ocean observations by having a very rigid and difficult process to follow. So solutions could be here that UNCLOS provides a basis for the regulation of observations, but observation is not only maritime scientific research. You can think about what Yoshi mentioned, the difference between marine scientific research and operational oceanography, which unfortunately is not defined in UNCLOS. And we talked about the atmospheric measurements, that those are regulated through what's known as a Jankov statement. And in practice, that means that it's fully okay to take measurements and observations from the atmosphere. So we can regulate in ocean observation on the purpose of the data instead on how and where they were collected. For instance, observations that are deployed on a very short notice to detect hurricanes, or rather predict their track and intensity better, are generally accepted because they are possibly saving human lives. So they fall under another convention called SOLAS, not the surface ocean atmospheric change, but the safety of life at sea convention. The other solutions here, we can think about sustained ocean observing as a tool to combat climate change, at least to understand climate change. So for instance, reliable weather forecast is dependent on ocean data, particularly when you look for a weather forecast more than a couple of days ahead. That has the potential to save human lives. And even to understand climate better, sea level rise, inundation, and so on, will save life and could possibly fall under SOLAS. So the regulation of data essential for combating climate change could be dependent on the output, the data, rather than the observations. Many of the essential climate variables and essential ocean variables are very important to do in the economically exclusive zones of nations. So there is a need to find a way to make this more efficient. There are other options on the table here. We mentioned Argo, how they have a notification scheme, which is useful. And we can use that on uncontrollable platforms such as ships of opportunity or sea turtles. So we can work on the regulations of marine scientific research. That could actually be working. We can also think about the World Meteorological Organization, how they need ocean observations for services they are obliged to provide to member states. We can also think about what is called the Global Basic Observing Network, GBON, within the WMO framework, and how climate and carbon observations are important. I'll stop here. I'll touch on two things, integration and the law of the seas. And now I've been talking as a scientist, trying to reach out to policymakers, and we heard Ian talk about his position as a policymaker trying to listen to science, and I hope we can have a good discussions around this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Toste. This is great insights in the work of Goose and the EuroSea project and what we have been trying to achieve so far. So initially, the plan was that Toste would moderate the discussion, but since Toste is now also one of the speakers, Toste, I don't know if you still want to moderate. I can also jump in if you like. Then if there's questions for you, that might be easier then.
You know, why don't you start moderating, and then we can have an open discussion. I think everybody has the right and possibility to open a mic. So I'm happy for you to take over.
Definitely. Okay, thanks. That sounds like a great solution. Thanks again, Toste. So there were some questions in the chat. And I think there was, Angel's first question. Angel, I will just read out your question. But I know that you're sharing an office with other people. So, Angel's question to Yoshi: would region-specific practical solutions trigger problems in the future, the same way that we have problems now with different approaches between nations? Yoshi, maybe you want to try to give an answer to that question?
Sure. Yeah, perhaps I can give my ideas about the question. And indeed, well, I presented region-specific practical solutions as one of the potential ways to overcome the issues faced by MSR implementers. And indeed, perhaps, well, I think given the fact, for example, Article 247 procedure has only been even thought to be developed in 2 regions at least, and I think in the European context it didn't work out. So it's only, as far as I'm aware, it's only the Pacific context which even succeeded in developing such procedures. I think the chances are slim for many regions to have different their own practical solutions. Having said that, of course, if there are different solutions or perhaps procedures in different regions, that could perhaps create another problem. But I'd say maybe the focus, maybe the advantage might be bigger to have a specific region-specific solution, and especially in a region where there is a persistent issue, especially those areas under sovereignty or perhaps maritime dispute. So I don't have a crystal ball, but perhaps region-specific solutions would be possible in regions where all the stakeholders are seriously engaged in the process of coming to an agreement. So even though these solutions might look differently from other regions, I don't think that may be a serious problem. I hope that answered to the question to some extent. Eric?
Yeah, thanks, Yoshi. Sorry. Ian also had a question for you, Yoshi, slightly related to ocean observing. It's a relatively broad question, so maybe you can try to answer that. What are the rules regarding the safety of navigation for unmanned vehicles, both airborne, surface, and underwater? Do we have something there?
Yeah, indeed. And I think that's a very pertinent question, because one of the elements Ian identified, which is unmanned autonomous surface vessels, that's the safety regulation for these types of for this type of ships is indeed under discussion at the International Maritime Organization. So I think the IMO is planning to develop an instrument in the second half of 2024, and they have completed the scoping exercise for that exercise last year. So they are in the process of developing something that kind of keeps keeps the regulation up to date for these types of vessels. For airborne vehicles, perhaps I'm not too familiar with that, but as long as I'm assuming the type of vehicles Ian is asking is the ones which starts in the airspace and then move into the sea, or is it something that continues flying?
Ian, you're muted.
Sorry, maybe launched from ships, for instance.
I see, thanks. Okay, so if a manned vehicle it's launched from the ships, and that part is already regulated under UNCLOS, and so basically coastal states can regulate such activities in the territorial sea. But for the EZ, perhaps it depends on the nature and purpose of that vehicle, and in some cases I think the questions might arise when it comes to dual use vehicles, and if they are also used for intelligence gathering purposes. I think I'm sure there will be some states which are very keen on regulating. Yeah, and I think on the operation aspect of these vehicles, perhaps the aero comes in again.
Yeah.
And for the underwater vehicles, I assume those basically dropped from the ship and then continues collecting data in the ocean, right?
Yeah, I was thinking, because about whether there's the safety rules come into it, because it could they could constitute some sort of danger to navigation, etc.
Right, indeed. And SOLAS is, I mean, the SOLAS convention could include regulation for such vessels, if I'm not mistaken. There are some exemptions and exceptions, but unless the administration tries to opt out, I think, and if the ship crosses the international boundary, then it can be subject to the regulations in the SOLAS convention.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Yoshi. one more question that is not just addressed to you, but I would start with you before we have a couple of questions that are specifically for Ian. Maria Hood asks, what will happen to MSR regulations when citizen scientists can upload coastal data with their cell phones to global data centers? That's a challenging one.
Indeed.
You can also get some time to think about it, and then I will have some questions for Ian, and then we come back to this one later. How about that?
Definitely. Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Thanks.
So then, Ian, question for you from Nicole. What are the pros and cons for spending more money on data collection than research? As for fisheries, the first example you gave, right? And the other way around, as for ocean observing. Is there an ideal balance in these two?
Well, yeah, I think in fish, well, for instance, in principle, once you you provide the observations by the EU, it's then possible for anybody to use these well, in principle, anybody to use these observations, and you open up for different people to innovate on the basis of these observations, I think, in research, and it makes a much more sensible way for there to be a whole European strategy for the collection of data that can then serve a variety of research that is not so well specified, that gives people more innovation to actually do it. I think there is a good case for it, but that's how it is. It is for fisheries and other observations. It's both situations. Research, the EU spends a lot more on research, whereas fisheries, it spends much more on data collection and less on research, because probably because the data collection is such, even within even if a lot of money is spent on research, somebody's got to collect the data.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Then another question from Angel. For public procurement of science for impact assessment of policies, cannot the Joint Research Center be a tool to overcome this?
Yeah, sometimes they help out if they have the expertise. But if we have to ask for them to do something specific, for dedicate a person for 3 months on something, then we'd have to pay for it, and that takes some organization as well, even if it's themselves, because they're all doing things anyway, and so to ask them to spend 3 months on something requires some effort and planning. But and also if they have the relevant expertise, which they don't always.
Okay, thank you. Yoshi, I bought you some time for the citizen science question.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Eric. Well, I'm still trying to gather my thoughts, but I'm just speaking as I speak. I'm gonna speak as I think. And so the first, perhaps the starting point is MSR regulations, or the coastal state regulation for MSR activities is not limited to kind of professional scientists or research institutions, and it covers all potential MSR projects or even activities as such. So if these activities fall under the scope of the MSR regulations. Of course, the implementers, including citizen scientists, need to comply with these regulations. And of course, perhaps when I read the question first, I was thinking of somebody on board vessel doing some type of research activity while in the sea. And I think in that case, one thing we need to keep in mind is when we are talking about activities in the sea, we need to pay attention to the nationality of the ship, and not necessarily nationality of the person who is doing activities. So the first perhaps issue that needs to be identified is whether the ship on board of which that person is doing research is a ship that belongs to the coastal state of that area, and that makes that determines the applicability of the MSR regulation of that particular state. And moving to the second part, or the last part of the question, it's kind of interesting to see that now we are talking about the issue of uploading the data to the data center. And indeed, I think MSR regulation, I didn't touch upon that issue in my presentation, but one of the issues related to MSR in the EZ or any area under sovereignty or under national jurisdiction is to what extent allowing publishing data. And in principle, UNCLOS talks about basically open data and the free flow of data. But for some information, and coastal states can require withholding data not to publish. Yeah, for now, that's all from my side. Eric.
Thanks, Yoshi. Yeah, Maria adds in the chat that Navionics, which I've not heard before, so I don't know exactly what it is, but maybe Maria, if you want, you can expand on that. Navionics already has a crowdsourced program for coastal bathymetry from sailboats, actually, so that's an addition. Hi, Maria, do you want to elaborate on that? Nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see everyone. Yes, I mean, I kind of threw this citizen science problem out there knowing that there's no solution, but it just reinforces Tosta's initial opening statement that the current MSR regulations are not adapted to the way we do ocean science these days. And we really, we've been sweeping this issue under the carpet for many years, and it's time to really look at the issues again, because the evolution of the observing system is really blocked until we can get around some of these issues. The Navionics is a chart plotting software that you use on sailboats, you can use on commercial craft as well. And for many years, they've been taking, anytime you go out on a sailboat, you've got a depth sounder, and you've got temperature and sometimes salinity, and GPS that gives you latitude and longitude. So they've had a crowdsourced program where you take the depth sounder information, so the bathymetry, latitude, longitude, they put it into a big database, and they use that to improve their charts. And in some cases, even commercial ferry operators and commercial ship operators are using those Navionics charts because they're much more precise than the official hydrographic office charts that they're required to have on board. So, I mean, these things are happening in sometimes even on a large scale already. And, sometimes we even have pushback from people in our own community saying, oh, please don't open up this MSR thing again, because it's going to just shut down things we're already doing, because we're already doing some things that kind of fly under the radar. But at some point, you know, we really do have to look at this and say, we just can't keep doing this. So, you know, in some ways, this MSR coastal, you know, citizen science thing may be both the problem and the solution. I mean, it's going to maybe the thing that tips people over the edge to say, okay, it's really time to look at this issue.
Thanks a lot, Maria, for that explanation. And this is something that I hadn't thought about before, the citizen science angle, and it seems like a really important one indeed. And Tosta had made a comment, I only just saw it now, that Tosta had made a comment before already that citizen science question is also valid for many other areas. Think about private yachts that would collect sea surface temperature or PCO2 or other more complicated variables and submit these to a public database. And Tosta, you also had a question related to Ian's presentation, I think, right? Would you like to ask that question yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Eric. Yeah, so to move away from the legal aspects here to something that you mentioned, Ian, and I was struck by the slide on beach plastic and port operations on plastic, and how in the end there was only one data set that was useful, and there seemed to be a very simple data set of 10 different most common things found on the beach. So I don't want to go into detail about that particular issue, but I think the more overarching question is, so what is then a useful data set for policymaker? How do you define that? And how can science understand and know what would be a useful data set for policy? And are there other ways? I mean, are you looking for data or are you looking for an assessment? I think IPCC, the climate assessment that comes out on a 5 to 6 years time scale, has been really paramount in driving that climate discussion forward. These are assessments based on peer-reviewed articles that kind of goes through a second stage of review and so on. There are, you know, drawbacks of IPCC because they are just 5 years and so on. But I mean, the question is, how can we know as scientists what you as policymaker would, you know, find as a useful product, be it a data set or an assessment?
Okay. Yeah. I think it's what you were saying before. I mean, a data set that's available, harmonized, that has that explains the confidence limits that you can use. I mean, they're building them now, but they're not always available. And of course, it's very difficult. Sometimes, like in Fukushima, I think that's an example. That's an example where you need information on a daily basis, and it's something that you've got to have set up already so that you can get this information quickly, and in a form that people can manipulate. Then for the plastics, yeah, we also, the other information we used was the sales of fishing gear, and which, if you work out how much they're buying each year, you can work out how much they lose in the sea. So that was something that was not necessarily an ocean observation. And you look at studies that have been made, answering specific questions that in the past. OSPAR have made some studies that were useful, but being able to, I mean, yeah, and there's a lot of information that's collected that doesn't get into the public domain, and it's impossible to get in a short time. This is, you know, collisions of boats with whales or something, you know, if you're working out a new rule on that. So it's a lot of the things that you were saying earlier about data on fair principles, because you don't have time to telephone everybody up who might have data that whether it's available or not.
So coming back to, I mean, this is a great answer, but I mean, there is a difference also between having a data set or you know, compiled data set, ideally harmonized and well attributed in quality control and so on, versus having an assessment or a review of papers. And I wonder where you as a policymaker can, I mean, you already, you show some examples of scientific papers that you had been reading and looking at. But you know, realize that, you know, there's another paper that says something different. So is data or are assessments more useful?
A bit of both. I mean, I don't think it's a I don't think it's a secret to say that the Marine Strategy Framework Directive is under review. This was an effort to produce an assessment of the marine environment according to 11 different descriptors, which you well know about the biodiversity. And what at the moment, they're having great difficulty in this directive because different people, different countries apply it differently. So often you find the assessment says unknown, you know, because that you don't have enough data. So of course, IPC standards, IPCC assessments are a gold standard, because, you know, they say this is such and such, it's very probable, slightly probable, or slightly possible. I mean, that of course is a great view. I mean, we looked at that for blue carbon, for instance, and there it says there's a wide uncertainty. So again, it's normally on a global level, whereas we're mostly interested in Europe.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just have one more question here, Ian. I think it was interesting that you in one of your slides, you said, well, you need information from an authoritative source. And the question is, what would be an authoritative source? Would that be university professors that publish a paper, or would that be an agency?
No, I think being peer reviewed, I think, is, like I said, IPCC is a good global. It's obviously a peer reviewed paper in a good journal is a good source. I think that's those are authoritative. Or if sometimes the regional Cs make a good assessment, you know, IC's working groups, you know, produce reasonable assessments that people look at. I mean, for instance, there's everybody says 80% of the plastics comes from the land, but nobody knows where that statement comes from. It's quoted often in quite serious documents, but there's not much basis for it. And especially when they start to look at some marine plastic, they find that a lot of it doesn't come from the land, like the Great Pacific Plastic Patch. So
that's right. There are many of these statements that are made are just pulling along. Another one is that every second breath we take comes from the ocean, right? So these are things once are coined, they're hard to get rid of.
Yeah, that second breath from the ocean, I think that's Sylvia Earle, right? Which who posed that thing. Thanks also, Ian, for your answers, and thanks, Tosta, for the answer. And also tying in the IPCC here, this is also a nice bridge to the second part of our session on Monday, where the first talk will be given by Hans Otto Pertner, who's actually the co-chair of Working Group 2 of the IPCC. So he will actually share some insights there. Let me see, there's one more question here from James. Ian, you used the term data collection. Do you think the term data curation could be added?
Yeah, that's obviously an important issue. Data curation, we call it, or data assembly and curation. That's what the Commission tries to do in the European Marine Observation and Data Network, for instance, where they try to collect, where it's got about 112 organizations trying to prepare data so that they're all in the same standards, there's the same nomenclature, the same baselines, and yeah, data curation is obviously a big issue. It's they're preparing a document on this. Oh no, that's something else.
That's great, Uncle. Sorry, I misquoted Sylvia Earle there, but please go to the chat. Last comment from Uncle is they're preparing a document on that. Every second breath comes from the ocean. Well, Tosta, you opened your mic. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I would want to come back to the different motivations of science and ocean research and policy. So we are often funded to do research and understand processes, and output is data, but also scientific papers. Whereas science policies has slightly different requirements, of course, and I mean, you'd mentioned that you could, put the procurement process out to find out an answer. But are there any other ways that, I mean, you can drive science, provide the answers that you think that you would need in some, in the future? I mean, obviously, I think the call-driven process in EU calls is probably a way like that, even though that is maybe DD research that does that mostly, and maybe there are some discussions between DDMAR and DD research on driving calls towards finding the right answer to a question that you think that you're going to have to answer in a year or two. How does that work really, and how can we be better at responding as scientists to policy need and in the long term, really the societal need? How can we make sure that our research is relevant more than our own curiosity, basically? You're muted. Yeah, I know.
It's partly our fault because we often issue calls for proposals that are so vague that or so impossible that that you can't discern a specific question in them. But we're trying now to in some of the research programs now to try to be much more specific in what we're asking. We've put a question in, for instance, into the next program on climate, the next work program on climate, about blue carbon, which is quite specific, and that is, by the way, in cooperation with our Chinese colleagues. So that will be, the project should be in cooperation with China. So yes, there is a process, at least within the EU, to try to get the policy GGs more involved in the framing of the research questions. They call it co-creation, and
Thank you, Ian.
We should also, sorry, one thing, we should also be a little bit aware of what's possible and not ask impossible questions, you know, because I often see repeated questions like, how do we do the ecosystem approach in fisheries, which is, you know, just too vague and you always get the same answer. You know, or even though it's something we know we want, we should also know that it's impossible to give an answer to it.
Yes, important point for sure. We have a few minutes left. Are there any other questions from the audience? If not, Tosta, do you have any other questions? Or any other questions from the speakers? Yoshi, Ian? If not, or Tosta?
I mean, maybe just another question here. I mean, Yoshi, particularly here, you heard us and your presentation also on the UNCLOS that there are issues and problems to update the implementation of section 13 in the UNCLOS process. And I wonder if you have any ideas and tips on how to facilitate that dialogue to come to solutions. I mean, to be practical and find a better way of doing things that respects the you know, the spirit of UNCLOS and the wording of UNCLOS, at the same time responds to the practicality of today's requirements and technology. How to go about this?
Right. Thank you, Toste, for that question. Indeed, I think, well, that's something I kind of left ambiguous in my presentation because I was kind of thinking about the time. So as I mentioned towards the end of my presentation, I believe there are different ways using international organizations. And in particular, I believe to some extent we are heading into a right direction, because I saw IOC well decided to take on some of the proposals made during the last I think Executive Council meeting, to basically to gather information on what has been the issues relating to ocean observations, and basically to start to, in a sense, to initiate a process for developing potential guidance in the future if necessary. I understand that, for example, in the course of the discussions, the idea to revitalize AVELOS was discarded, perhaps by the opposition, through the opposition by some of the member states. But I think still they are, even though they are at an earlier stage, I think it's a useful process to be pursued, and perhaps it is. Well, first of all, nothing can be solved in a minute. So I think this might be an extensive process. But for example, if you look at the development of the Argo notification scheme, it took, at least through AVELOS, it took 6 years. And if you count the years, a few years before that, it was like almost a decade project. So the problems wouldn't go away instantly, but I believe we are on the right path to becoming, coming closer to a more favorable condition for marine scientific research and other ocean observing activities. And of course, you might consider pressuring other bodies like the UNGA, and I think the ICP this year, and the discussion at the ICP this year was very fruitful, and these discussions will hopefully be taken up at the informal consultations on the omnibus resolution this year, and potentially the GA could further direct IOC or some other organizations or bodies to be engaged in that process. So I think this is not an unilateral process, and it's more like different organizations work towards the common objective of making increasing scientific knowledge and data for the purpose of making our lives better. So I think the legal issues are not there to impede the process. Rather, I think they should work more as an enabler for these valuable objectives. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yoshi. Very much appreciated. In the time zone where I am in, it's 2 minutes to noon. And that means we have 2 minutes left. Tosta, any urgent? No? Okay, then I will just take this chance to thank you all very much for your participation, especially the 3 speakers. We did try to get the gender balance right, which we didn't get right in the end, right? So that was also due to some last minute cancellations, as said already. We will do better on Monday. So thanks a lot, Yoshi. Thanks a lot, Ian. Thanks a lot, Tosta, also for jumping in at the last moment. Thanks a lot for all the people engaged in the audience and listening and asking questions. We hope you will all be there on Monday at 2 o'clock Central Eastern European summertime. No, Central European summertime. Sorry, Central European summertime. Please check which time zone that is for you. Information is all on the website. We hope to see you all back then for 4 really interesting presentations, then where we discuss these issues from the science side. Okay, thank you and see you all on Monday. Have a nice day.
Very much, Eric.